have the pleasure of introducing Amanda Krugliak. Amanda is an artist and the arts curator at the University of Michigan Institute for the Humanities. As an artist, she has performed at venues including Lynx Hall in Chicago, the San Francisco Fringe Festival, the Detroit Institute of the Arts, and NYU's Performance Festival. As a curator, she has worked with artists such as Mark Dion, Mary Mattingly, Charles Atlas, Tracy Snelling, and Scott Hawking. Her collaboration with artist Richard Barnes and anthropologist Jason De León for the exhibition State of Exception gained national recognition and was exhibited at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, and Parson School of Design in New York. The show exhibited hundreds of abandoned objects such as backpacks, water bottles, clothing, toothbrushes left behind by people crossing the US-Mexico border through the deserts of Arizona. This show was my introduction to Amanda's work and to Amanda as a storyteller. When I first encountered this piece in Detroit, I was struck by the stories and individuals that these backpacks represented, and the immensity and severity of the journey taken to cross into the US. Yesterday, during a workshop with 17 of my students, Amanda asked each student to share their own experiences and stories through an object that they found meaningful. Each story and object held something special about the person, and Amanda took the time to recognize it and celebrate it. Stories are a way to bring people together, to learn from each other, to share something, to look closer at something that seems ordinary. In Amanda's work, stories are about the people telling them, about finding value in each person and forming new connections with them. So thank you, Amanda, for being with us today and for generously sharing your story with us. Please join me in welcoming Amanda.
I thought that today a way to kind of move into these stories that aren't my own, and to be quite honest, they really only need a very delicate frame, might still be to share with you my story, my way in. Because really, how do we ever get, to this place? We think that it's going to be easy. You're young and you think there's going to be this line and these signs clearly marked, enter, walk this way. It's like one of those rides on the amusement park or at the zoo, Monkeyville, Lion Country, Gorilla Hotel, and if you're strapped in safely, you're going to get where you want to go. But art and life and love are not a line. They are a circle. It is the beginning and the ends of things, the things undone. And we run into ourselves coming and going. And it really is about that thread that runs through it all, that you might not even realize yet, what drives you, what carries you, what turns you on. It's a fragment, a color, a swatch, not what we come to know and understand, but what we cannot possibly know yet, what we long for and yearn for. And the only way really to reach that is getting out of yourself and thinking about those around you and how you connect to other people, what that next step is. These are the stories that guide us, a song, a poem, a question. And there is a generosity in that reach towards another human, that compassion. So I grew up in a small town in Ohio. It's best known for a building shaped like a football and the grave of William McKinley, who was not the greatest president. And I was the daughter of two first-generation Americans. Their parents were immigrants. My father was Ukrainian Jewish, and my mother was Romanian Catholic. And it was World War II, and they fell in love in a courtroom. She was translating a murder case for a Romanian priest, and he was the attorney, a defense attorney for that county. And apparently they fell in love. Well, everyone was horrified because he was Jewish and she wasn't, and they were from different sides of the tracks. And those two people taught us as they, put their stakes down with that turquoise ranch house in the middle of this town, this house that didn't look like anybody else's. They made us understood what it meant to be other, that we were other. And in that, in that orientation, we didn't look for people like ourselves. We didn't want to belong to some club. We actually appreciated the unique mix, that unique combination of the way we come together. And in that, not only can we be extraordinary and have extraordinary lives, but just maybe we can try to do something extraordinary, whether we always get there or not. I first started as a painter. I was interested in this idea of an imprint, of gesture, of some marker of my life, little fragments, little stories, and the energy behind painting, the visceral nature of that, the materiality of that. You can see these paintings, which were a series done on a kitchen table over the course of a year when I had a small kid and I couldn't really keep a studio, are all about these small fragments, just daily records, daily paintings. At a certain point, I was living in San Francisco, and honestly, I was this exuberant, idealistic painter, but so many things were happening in the world. AIDS was happening, and people were dying, and I was a young woman who began to understand how a woman felt in the world, the mistreatment, these small indiscretions. There were issues with the homeless. There was censorship. So it just felt like it wasn't enough for me, personally, just to be in my studio. I wanted to reach out. And I sold a number of paintings, and I decided for a summer I was going to start writing stories. And from that, I had a show, and I created these works, and I got up and I did a show about a woman in her room telling these stories. And the whole point of that was to reveal something you otherwise might not know or talk about, that vulnerability, the momentum of that. What was the momentum of my life, the anxiety of that experience? How might that reach out to another person, make them feel better, make them feel it was okay to stand up? Even then, I was thinking about baggage, what we carry, what we leave behind. I had moved. I would move 10 more times in my life across the country, married, divorced, children, one apartment to another. So that idea of transition, of moving, of looking for something better, that really resonated for me. And also being somewhat disfranchised. This idea of a momentum, the frenetic nature of being a human. And also, this was a really important moment for me because I felt like this work had a place in the progression of art, in art that had been important to me, about gesture, about the human experience. Oftentimes, there would be something in a performance that would be about the endurance, something where I had to run for 40 minutes or where I had to punch a bag, which was my alter ego that kept hitting me in the face. In 2002, I moved back to Ann Arbor from California. I was soon divorced. I had to think on my feet. I became a curator with the university. And interestingly enough, I have to say, I had never once really felt this was anything more than another part of my practice. I wasn't ever thinking, oh my God, I have to work with this other person and do this show, and my name isn't the first name on the wall. That really was never an issue. It actually felt like it was this opportunity to work with amazing people, to bring people there, to put our place out into the world, and to be inspired. And that had a direct connection then to work that I would do. I worked with Creative Time out of New York. They had a show called Democracy in America. And I felt it would be great if we brought a small satellite show to Ann Arbor, to the university. And this is a picture of this soapbox event by artist Pia Lindman, which allowed people to get up and talk. So this is like 14 years ago. But right then, I knew there was a way that art and activism had to be put together for me as an artist. What could I do there? Which was also an imprint. So I guess I want to reiterate to you, there's no real lack of continuity in all of this. It kind of all was a process. I worked with Mark Dion, who's a dear, friend and colleague of mine now. And Mark pretty much knows all I can think of about collections, objects, how to think about that critically, how institutions and society organize the way that we see things. How do you get ahead of that and think about what could I do to really change the way people see? This is an installation he made for our gallery. I'm sitting there on the desk as an unhappy secretary. The next project that I did, which really, again, took me to another step, was meeting and working with artist Richard Barnes. He's a renowned photographer. He does work for National Geographic and Smithsonian, the New York Times. And he thinks about objects and spaces in terms of a more formal approach, this observation, standing outside and observing. And we ended up really collaborating. Rather than really just being a curator, we talked all the time. Writing became a big part of this process. Poets that we were thinking of, things that we'd seen, a series of letters, texts that we wrote. So it was really about this 19th century romanticism in a very, very personal way. And ultimately, it was about bringing these objects out of the museum into the light. And this was a cast of a prehistoric whale that we transported down the main street of Ann Arbor to the gallery. And then it became part of this conversation around objects and history and imprint and proof, how objects might be organized and create false narratives. These are all fakes of actual Native American tools, but the way that we put them on the table alluded to the fact that they were somehow precious artifacts. I'm also quite close to an artist in Detroit who taught me a great deal, Scott Hawking. He goes into abandoned factories in that town and buildings and excavates them really as sites in the moment, in the middle of it. So not looking back, not looking forward, but this place in transition and the haste of that. What the objects tell us, again, if he includes these objects in a broader conversation of antiquity, how do they take on a different value or meaning? How do you see them differently? Right after that, I guess about 2012, I heard about the work of Jason De León, who's an amazing scholar, anthropologist at the University of Michigan. And he had a project called the Undocumented Migration Project, where he was collecting objects with students in the desert, Arizona and Mexico, right on that border, which would be Arivaca. And I decided I wanted to think about how I was going to create an exhibition about these objects, ultimately about these stories, because that's really where my in is, right? That's where I'm passionate, telling these stories. And it made sense to me because of this same thing, being 6 years old and feeling other, being divorced and feeling, feeling out of the loop, feeling like I was at the outside of the living room looking in. And we all know what that's like, wanting a place to belong, of comfort. So I called up Jason and I said, can I please make a show about this work? Is that okay? And at that time, the work was just stored in his garage in a bunch of U-Haul boxes. And I called up Richard Barnes and I said, I want you to be my partner, because I think if the three of us work together on this, it's going to be something that is informed from all sides. So we weren't going to over-aestheticize it, and it would be based on the research, and Jason would inform us. We weren't going to just be these two artists who had an idea, and it didn't really tie to the real people, to the experience from all sides. These are the kind of objects that Jason, over 5 years, collected in the desert outside of Arivaca in Arizona. And for 5 weeks every summer, he took students, and continues to collect and archive and how they're organized and cataloged. Water bottles, paper, bandages, backpacks that speak to that country and also the West. I mean, there are as many Nike backpacks as backpacks that say Mexico. It's not really about one place or another. We aren't like that. We move, we migrate. Personal items, money, which speak to a certain violence. When you find an object like that somehow, it's so intimate, just laid in the open. Also, these strange bottles that you can't help but think about, bottles from history that you might see in a museum. The one bottles are left by Good Samaritans. The others are covered to protect them from the heat because it's so intensely hot. Toothbrushes, toothpaste, deodorant, aftershave, comic books, Bibles, porn, everything. Because there isn't one story, and there isn't one person, and it isn't one experience. It's just people. So these kind of objects that reflect daily ablutions or rituals, they're familiar to us. And oftentimes familiar objects become particularly resonant because we can relate to them. Bottles for dehydration. And this is how the desert actually looks in this area, these washes of objects. And I went into the desert. Richard went into the desert as well, following Jason and the students. And he and I began this correspondence of texts and letters from our experiences there. This is a drone. This shows you really that terrain if you're not familiar with it. Also the allure and beauty and mystery of this amazing place. You know, geography has everything with this issue, right? It defines this journey, the arduousness of this landscape. When I was there, just a day after I left, the students found a woman in the desert who was dead. And I bring that up because imagine what that was like for these students, much like yourself, you know, finding this, being so idealistic and invested. And for us, it really galvanized this. And this was like, 6 years ago, 7 years ago now that we really started this process. And we're unfamiliar with this material or these issues as intimately as we became. And I came back and I wrote to Richard at the time. These students sat with her for hours. I couldn't help but, it affected me so profoundly too, as a woman alone. Who was she? What brought her to this place, this end? Was she seeking what we all seek, something better on the other side of things? In this place, this strange stage of limbo, her life erased without ritual, even in death. So I think that was it, that even regardless of politics, we were talking about human beings and people and the honor and rituals that we usually give attention to honor one's experiences or lives. So that was, a really profound moment in this process and really early on. This is an example of a wash that you would find. This is a photograph Richard took that showed up in the Times also. Backpacks that almost immediately are disintegrating from the extreme heat and the conditions. This is what is called a makeshift or lean-to, and it seems really uninviting, but it's oftentimes where people might, sleep. There you see some more of these objects. And I guess I'm just showing you this kind of a run-through so you can get a sense of what these all are in their natural environment, traces of this. What do they tell us? What can they possibly, not tell us? What don't we know? These are notebooks that were left. And by this point, they're back in the lab. Again, those bottles are so interesting. Child's abacus, so odd really to think of that. And then I couldn't help but think of things from Pompeii or, the great rain of the world and how all this really is just another human story, how that all plays from past to present to future. It's just hard to see it because time has everything to do with the way we think about a story and what we care about. And, we don't have enough time to reflect, so it's hard to see when you're in the middle of it. This is what this all looked like when we first did our first exhibition, which took place in Ann Arbor, Michigan. These are the boxes from Jason's garage. And that's interesting, too. Like, why is this in a U-Haul box and something else might be hermetically sealed in a drawer? It's a question. I don't know if I have an answer, but it's a question that leads to another question. This is the original installation of this work, and it was in a 20 by 20 room, and you really had to engage with the materiality with these backpacks. It was like a sanctuary. It was lovely, but, quite intimate. And at this point, which would have been 2012, these hadn't been seen. You hadn't seen them in press or pictures. It was, again, like bringing something out into the light, just like the artifacts of the prehistoric whale, just like a personal story hidden in a box. It was very important to me, the aesthetics of this as a painter. I thought of it as a painting in the way that we put it together. This gives you a close-up on what these backpacks had to say. At this point there was no audio. Later on we included stories that ran in the gallery, but you don't really know who the people are. It's resilient, it's exuberant, it's ominous, it's uncertain, it's uncomfortable not to really have a sense of what it's telling you, and yet you definitely respond to this material as the absence of the person, as the connection to the person. We decided that the entryway into the exhibition would be a video in 3 parts of the floor as you would be walking over it to set people off balance. It really was jarring, and it forced you to think you were in a different space. So that was very intentional. By the way, all of this is done, Jason is like our person that we consult with regularly, and Richard and I are thinking about the visual representations and exhibition itself. We included all of the students, that's Jason in the upper left, different students that were part of that initial crew, because we felt at this point the research was a frame. The first time we did it, we felt that was an important piece. Here you begin to see these objects arranged differently. What if you put them in a vitrine? How do they look now as opposed to in the desert? This gives you sort of a little bit better view of the space itself, walking in from this small door, turning the corner, representation of landscape. That object in the right, I always found fascinating, and we tried different ways of incorporating that as to whether it looked like a Civil War flag. It just had a way of being, a gesture that tied it into many things. It's actually a sweatshirt on a stick that was found just like that in the desert. So after this show, we had dozens of classes. People came to this, even though we were in the mitten. It made a little impression. It felt like people noticed. And that summer, the New York Times wanted to run this as a centerfold of the New York Times Magazine, which is this installation that we created. And every time we do the piece, you should know Richard and I make it. We don't pass it off. No one else is creating this installation. And it's also before backpacks were used, with the exception of Weiwei. Now backpacks are so much a part of our visual culture for other causes. But at that time, that wasn't the case. It was still relatively new as an image to use to connect to people and represent a human experience. Anyway, this was the image, and the New York Times wanted to run it, and we were so excited, and then they said, okay, but the other thing is, we don't want to tell anybody that you designed it. We're going to run it just on its own because we don't want to include any conversation about aesthetics. And I bring that up just as artists because, it was hard to hear that at the time. And all I could think about was my dad back in that town in Ohio in his bathrobe looking at the New York Times and seeing me somehow connected with the project. And I decided, and Richard and Jason, that it was so important we get this image out. That was really what mattered. And that, too, was a turning point in terms of how I thought about the work and what matters about this work. So it ran in the New York Times, and they did an online article also about our work collaboratively, and it reached so many people. It was an amazing moment. So this would have been 2013. It then went to MoCAD, Detroit, and we began to do a lot more community outreach. By the way, we always had panels of people, Good Samaritans, Dream 9 students, people who'd taken the journey. Even Border Patrol were brought in terms of their opinions and outlooks. So that perspective, 360 degrees, was really, really important. Each time getting closer to the actual people and away from the objects, which is ultimately what happened for us. So this is MoCAD. We went into schools with this material, talked to students, largely communities of undocumented people. Here you see a kind of a detail of a display of those same objects you saw before. Here, scale becomes very important. It's in a warehouse, it's vast, it's urban, it's dirtier somehow than that initial installation. This is a photograph of Richard's that we included of a tree. in the desert with this carving. So we incorporated more photography. These are photographs of the students' tattoos who worked on this project. And I include that because, again, it's a reference, or it can't help but reference other moments historically, which is troubling and problematic if you think of tattoos and atrocities. And yet I think significant and necessary, so that we don't begin to think that one atrocity is somehow better than another, that one inhumanity somehow weighs heavily and another one doesn't. That all of these things are about humanity and morality and how we treat each other. This is at Site Lab, which was an art installation in Grand Rapids. This was an abandoned auto garage in a neighborhood largely Hispanic that had suffered foreclosures. So here it really is a public art piece. Here it really does something else. This is the installation in that raw space. And now 10,000, 100,000 people are coming to see this. And we are directly impacting the community that it serves. And we had meetings where people shared their stories and felt honored by these objects. And that's really ultimately what the work meant. We then went to New York to Parsons. And right before we were invited to Parsons, this is before the election, we're thinking, I don't know, it seems like things are going pretty well. What are we going to, is this a good thing? Do you think it doesn't matter in the way that it's mattered? Okay, and we signed to do this show at Parsons, and then of course we have the election, and suddenly things have changed dramatically. And we're in New York the day of the Muslim travel ban, the first ban, and it was painful the whole time. We all threw ourselves into this project, and this is the opening night of Parsons. This is the same exhibit that was in that tiny room. And I tell you that because you cannot ever know where you start and where you end, and what one small thing, how that unfurls, and then the impression that makes. We included in this particular exhibition photographs from actual undocumented migrants that had crossed, so now their pictures are included, audio, interviews in Spanish. So again, moving further away from object, but still using that obviously as the place of contact, the way in. Here these objects take another take. This for me was the most gratifying, I have to say. There's the object that you saw early on of this strange flag. And for this particular iteration, we included individual clothing, thinking more about that reign of objects and human experiences again, thinking about friezes, the friezes of Pompeii or antiquity, the gesture, the shirt, a shirt from, what that shirt in the air, that, capturing that human gesture. These are objects from the coroner's office found on those who were unidentified. And I want to also say that we're in communication with humanities groups, and there's been efforts to connect people with objects and follow the family of the woman that was met. So none of those things have been left to the wayside. They're really an integral part of this work. These are tires from Border Patrol cars that we had sent, which felt important to include as well. There are those bottles you first saw, and these strange landscapes and the impression that they made on us all of those, months and months before. So the arc of this project is really, about a 5-year project, 5 years that we worked on it and changed it each time and revised it. And then in March 2017, it was reviewed in the New York Times. Trump had been elected. It made the front page also of the Times. And on that day, it ran in hometown newspapers all over the United States, all over the world, from here to Antarctica. The Associated Press picked up this image. And that's really something. I don't know, we didn't change the world, but we kind of made that imprint, maybe. I it's kind of incredible. And that speaks too to the way that images are now out in the world, or the opportunity for them to be, for better or for worse. You know, what is that about? From that material, from that small room, to the internet, to the world in a day. You know, it's quite extraordinary. I just wanted to finish with a piece of writing that I wrote as part of this brochure. I have some of these, by the way, on the table if you're interested, and I can certainly send you one if you want to contact me. And this tells you a little bit more about the research, the data. There isn't a line, no crossing, no checkpoint, no cop, no running fence between us, no floodlight, no God. Just a place for the asking, a small space, an exception, a lean-to, makeshift, a shelter, a wash. Thank you. Oh my gosh, they have more backpacks than anything, and they're still collecting them. So the first iteration, we used 600. In the last, I feel there were double that in that installation. But I think Jason probably finds 1,000 a year.
I noticed in like a lot of your pictures, the Dora Explorer one.
Oh yeah.
Is that like one of your more, the one that you guys like the most or something?
Well, we did think it was important. It's a slippery slope. You don't want to really manipulate people's emotions. I don't want to decide for people what they should think or how to feel. But I think it's a backpack that represents the ambiguity of the situation, a small child's backpack. And also the Western world and TV and, something you can relate to. So yeah, we liked that, and we tried to use it every time in the exhibitions. Yeah.
Did you edit out some items? Like I would have thought maybe there would be more toys or something else. So did you make decisions to not use certain items that you found? Or what was part of that editing process with what you decided to re-present in the gallery?
I think we, sort of connected to this question, we really didn't want to choreograph it so overtly, so we wouldn't use things like a doll baby or a rosary or some, maybe we did, but very subtly. Like we didn't want to be too heavy-handed in the way we presented the material so that we pulled on heartstrings, but we did want to show the range of objects. So there was a baby bottle in it, I think, and a piece of embroidery, or you don't see it in the slides, but there was a pretty wide range from beer cans left by the Border Patrol to drug booties to the child's abacus to intimate objects. So we tried to include that without being manipulative with an object. Yeah.
What happened to the woman's body after the encounter?
They stayed with her in 8 hours until the authorities came, and then she was taken to the coroner's office there. And Jason ended up befriending her family, reaching out to her relatives, finding them, visiting them in Ecuador. Yeah, so it was, and knowing her children. So, it ended up being an amazing relationship from all that. Yeah.
I may have misheard it, but you said that sometimes when you would find an item, you would track down the people who were undocumented and receive those items. Are they, is that information kept confidential?
Yeah.
Sometimes, I see.
We didn't do that, Richard and I, but Jason did that if there was an opportunity to try to make contact. You have to remember too, a lot of these are just left because of crossing over and wanting to pass and not draw attention to the fact that they were making this journey. So some of these things were less precious than others. Some, though, alluded to disappearances or, uncertainty. So he worked directly with Robin Reinecke with the coroner's office in terms of anything that felt like a clue, or someone's family might want something. Yeah.
You said the goal was not to manipulate people's emotions.
Right.
But is that not the goal of the project? Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? Where it's to evoke emotion to address the problem.
I think.
Why would you not use certain items that would maybe evoke stronger emotions for stronger responses?
I think we showed restraint, and certainly the first exhibition, all we wanted to do was reveal it. We were still thinking about research. We were also, as an institution, not creating a political stage, really. It really was more for people to engage. And that's what I would say. Yes, we wanted people to feel for this, but it's hard not to when you're around any of it from any one item. But we did try to steer away from something that really felt like, okay, this is what I want you to think about this. I do think our sensibility was not to do that, which is not to say that the project didn't become activism. For all three of us, it became activated by the human story, and it ended up there, of course.
One of those pictures really was very sad for me. It brought me back to a time when I was walking through Auschwitz.
Yes.
And I remember that I looked at the ovens and the fence and I was sad. But when I walked through the part where they had a glass, and behind the glass were shoes and glasses
yes.
and teeth, and you just stood there thinking about stories. Whose shoes, who lived there, whose teeth were those? And that brought me back to that. And it's very true that there's a person that wore every backpack.
Yeah, and those are also the images I grew up knowing of or seeing, or conversation I was closer to, and part of the history of my family or generation. So absolutely, the power of that, it never leaves.
What parts of all the immigration has stuck? Why do you focus? I'm curious as to why you focus a lot of your storytelling and a lot of your art history on immigration.
I think because I relate to those stories. I relate to that struggle and that yearning, and because I come from the background I do, feeling disenfranchised, feeling other in a small town, So I think that it's embedded in me as a storyteller and a person, that I care about other people's stories and experiences in that way.
Just to add to her point, taking away the young lady, taking away the objects, right, from what is actually there, isn't that also a point where you also manipulate the story? Because I'm just adding to what she's
it's okay.
So if you're not showing the full story,
right,
what is the true story that you're trying to portray? Because to take away something and not showcasing that, also to me also manipulates.
I understand. Well, I do think they're all fragments, and I think that's interesting to me too. That story doesn't tell you everything, even your own, and it's always about omission or inclusion, even your own story. So, to a certain extent, a story is not completely transparent or available. A story is what you tell, and then what people take from it, and they create their own story. In this instance, these objects, we did try to be pretty democratic about showing a broad range of objects. These are not people that could also tell their own story or this story, and all we had to go on was their response, that community who felt really honored by the way it had been handled, that it wasn't overtly aestheticized, that it was fairly democratic and put out to you in a way for you to respond. So that was reassuring. But it's an issue. It's a question. I still am uncertain. I can't give you a right or wrong about it, except to tell you I know how we move through it. And I do see your point about object and what one chooses to curate in regards to a story that isn't your own, which isn't to say we don't have compassion for one another in our stories.